Cha-cha.
Mr. Potato Head and his bucket of parts. New from...
Have actually is so she'll go onto TikTok and I play a game called Upspell. Do you know the game Upspell?
No.
Yeah, so it's basically you get the Scrabble, rack, right, of 7 letters, and then you make as many words as you can, and it keeps throwing in new letters, and it horribly addictive. It's fine now because now I can just sit and play it for like 10 minutes or so. And I'm okay, because 10 minutes is 5 games. 12 maybe, because there's time in between each game. When I first started playing that game, I would stop in the middle of writing a story for Mac OS Can. And I don't mean I would play between stories. I would stop in the middle of a story.
No!
Because I was just horribly, horribly addicted to that game. But, here I am months later, still playing it. It's worth it. It's like $2, I think. And it was actually a former Apple engineer who made the game. Upspell. It is called. And this is not.
I actually love Scrabble. Words with Friends has gotten weird. I used to play that a lot, but the interface of Words with Friends has gotten very odd, and I guess they're trying to make it more interesting to the youngs or something. But I find it really busy and hard to use, and so I've gotten out of the habit. But I would look into that. I'll probably lose my mind and play it, and it'll be fun.
The only drag is you're playing by yourself. You can't play with somebody else.
You can't play a game with others. Okay.
No, the one thing you can do though is if you get a good score, you can throw it up there. Basically, you can share it to Twitter or wherever.
Which is so not me. I just don't.
Well, it's a challenge though, because here's the thing. I'm not saying you're bragging, but at that point you're like, I got this score, and so here, and apparently, the code that it sends out, it will then send those people the same letters that you got. So they're playing
beat your score
on the same board, right, with you. Although they can't be completely, because if you start off and you get a 7-letter word, right, then you've got 7 new letters. Whereas if they start off and they get 4, it's interesting. I haven't done that part of it. I did share my highest score, which is 430 something one time. And then nobody
That's
ever
really
wrote
good
back
on
to
a
me.
Scrabble.
Well, yeah.
I mean, if the scoring is the same.
Well, no, the scoring is not the same at all. You're just making words and throwing them out there. It's more like bananagrams or whatever that was called. Yeah. You want to talk about that instead of Texas? Oh, by the way, I should let people know Shelly Brisbin is here with us, host of Parallel. She didn't want to brag about it earlier this week, but I'll go ahead and tell you. If you want to follow her on Twitter, almost couldn't be easier. Shelly. That's it. That's how early she was. That's how smart she was. Getting the name.
Just one E, not 2 E's.
Just one E, right, Shelly. Yep. So there you go. You mentioned on yesterday's show, you're in Texas. I have this thing, and I told you about it before, but I'll tell everybody else really quickly. I went to school in Boston for a while, and I had some friends who were born and raised in Somerville, Massachusetts, and one of them thought that the reason I went to Boston to go to school was because we didn't have schools in the South.
Oh, God.
Because her impression of the South came almost entirely from, the Beverly Hillbillies. Her ideas of the South were, from movies and TV, like Dukes of Hazzard, things like that. And so, I pretended like I had never been to a movie theater before I went there as well. And then I started calling her all kinds of names, none of them nice nor repeatable on anything like broadcast anything. We all have an idea of what the South is like. We all have an idea of what Boston is like. We all have an idea of what California is like. Now, some of us might have an idea that, okay, San Francisco is a little bit different than LA, but, California is California. And we all know what Texas is like. Maybe we know that from Dallas. Maybe we know that from movies and TV. I was thinking yesterday about how everybody in Texas drinks Coors, I guess. Why were Why were they going to Texas? Why in Smokey and the Bandit were they going to Texas to pick up Coors? Because Texas is still east of the Rockies, but that's where they're going to pick it up. Well, okay, well, whatever.
We don't make it here, and we make lots of beer.
Yeah,
and we make lots of bad beer too.
No. Everybody there is the same, Shelly. Everybody there is the same.
Sorry. Yeah, and I was born and raised here, so clearly.
Okay, you were born and raised there? Because I know you live in Texas now. Okay, so originally what I wanted to talk about was how's Texas? And I know there's not one Texas, except, when we heard about the storms a couple of weeks ago, when we heard about the the horrible freezing temperatures a couple of weeks ago. I mean, that hit a huge part of the country, but it was Texas that we heard about because, this one place, the Lone Star State, seemed to be suffering immeasurably across the board. I guess what I want to know is, like, how monocultural is Texas, and how is Texas doing?
Well, it's not monocultural. The weird thing is that, and I've known about plenty of natural disasters that happen in other places, and I try really hard not to go, oh, well, there was an earthquake in California. I better check with my friends in LA and San Francisco and see how they're doing. Because most things like that are like
local,
that.
Right?
But because most of Texas really did become incredibly cold, and because we're all on the same power grid, it probably affected more of Texas than it otherwise would have, and certainly more than these kinds of disasters would have affected another state at a different time, because we're on our own power grid, by God. Mm-hmm. And the place in Texas that was affected differently is El Paso, which is not on the Texas power grid. They are on a power grid to the west, New Mexico and Arizona, and so they had pretty cold temperatures in El Paso, freezing temperatures, but they did not lose power in the ways that most of the rest of the state did.
Remind me, so Texas, I'm gonna be stupid. Texas is huge. I used to live in Oklahoma. It gets cold in Oklahoma in the winter. I remember there was one really bad ice storm that we didn't have power for, I want to say maybe 3 days, because there were so many power lines down, because there were so many trees that weren't, they couldn't handle the weight of the ice, and they fell and snapped the lines, and, we had no heat for 3 days. And I've never worn as many layers of clothes in my life at one time as I did then. Was the Panhandle as affected as everything else? Because that runs parallel with Oklahoma. So
they get snow. I mean, in the Panhandle, right. Amarillo and Dalhart and all those places, they get snow in the winter, and they get cold temperatures. They were affected as the rest of us were by the power outages.
Okay.
And the power outages were caused by problems with the grid, not by down power lines or by ice on the power lines or any of that sort of stuff. And that's why the problem was so widespread, is because it was all about the power grid breaking. And once the power grid broke, water utilities started to break. And then the freeze started breaking water mains, and it became this cascading thing. So for the first couple or 3 days, a lot of people didn't have power. And I should say really quickly that we had power in my house, and we feel incredibly fortunate because we live really near a hospital. And I think there are probably people who are in a similar situation to that. But most people in Texas were affected one way or another. They didn't necessarily lose power for several days, but I think most people either lost power or they lost water at some point. So, and I know some of this because in my day job, we've been doing a lot of reporting about various parts of Texas. And it was, in rural Texas, it was issues with livestock and agriculture. In urban Texas, it was issues with not being able to fix the water mains fast enough, or with water plants not having the power to maintain. And here in Austin, Texas, they had to evacuate part of a hospital because they didn't have, backup power. And it all just happened at once. And so it spread everything thin. And it all goes back to the fact that the power plants were the energy industry was deregulated. The power plants were not sufficiently weatherized, and the power grid therefore failed because it was all dependent on each other, and there isn't any redundancy from outside the state. And it's just this whole cascade of things that was pretty much 5 days long. And I should also say that we knew that the weather part was coming. Like, it wasn't 2 days before it got really cold. They were warning you, okay, if you have, now's the time to charge up the power bricks for your phones or lay in extra water. And I think a lot of us probably weren't convinced it was going to be as bad as it was going to be. And I don't even think people knew how bad it was going to be. But there was warning that it's going to be down in single-digit temperatures, which in Austin, Texas, where I live, is a pretty rare event. I remember it being 10 degrees once. Even so it was pretty rare, and we knew that. But there wasn't an expectation that for a week you might either be without power or water or both.
There were, and I don't know how much is hyperbole and how much is, well, there was some news thing that I heard someplace, I can't remember where, but there was a concern that there was going to be Katrina level follow on. Because, Hurricane Katrina happened, and it's like, wow, that's bad, but I guess everybody's okay. And then, of course, days and days and days went by, and it's like, no, nobody's okay. Nobody's okay. I mean, not nobody, but I mean, the numbers were staggering after Katrina. Is there still that kind of concern in Texas now? Or, I mean, like, do you feel like damage has been assessed and we have an idea? Or are there still like, if we turn this thing over, we're going to find a lot more?
I think there are small pockets. I don't think it's anything like Katrina scale. Mm-hmm. There are still apartment complexes that haven't had water for 2 weeks because that needs to be fixed at the complex level, and it's probably not the city's responsibility. It's probably the owner of the apartment complex's responsibility, and they have to fix it at that level, and then they have to go in and they have to fix everybody's individual pipes. They did start finding, unfortunately, right after it happened, in the week after it happened, they found folks who had frozen to death. Yeah. I think that part is probably over. I think for individual families and lives, there's probably a lot of damage that we'll never know about because either they will, they'll apply for FEMA and it won't become a news story, or just because they'll, do what they've done so many times is just, bear it and move on. And the folks in Houston who suffered from Hurricane Harvey 3 years ago, a lot of folks, got hit again in a very, very different way with this storm. And that I don't think in places like Houston and in South Texas, especially where there's no snow. You just don't get snow in Houston. Mm-hmm. It wasn't the snow that was the harm. It was the lack of power and water and such. But they really I think that's where you'll see damage that isn't known now is places like Houston, where it's just a cascade of events in a place that was completely unprepared for them.
Is this the kind of thing, and you may not be able to answer this, but well, having been born and raised there, as you said, does change come from this? Or is it the kind of thing where it's like, well, that was bad. Let's hope that doesn't happen again. Are there things that could have been done to prepare? It seems like the answer to that is yes, because we keep hearing it wasn't weatherized enough, it wasn't protected enough. Is this the kind of thing that might actually, spur change? Pardon my use of the term spur. Well, is this the kind of thing that will spur change, or is this the kind of thing that, well, fingers crossed that we're not doing this again in 5 years? I'm going to speculate, and I have to be slightly political about it too, because I feel like the leadership of the state. First of all, there was a lot of finger pointing and blame gaming. We had our governor, after 2 days, go on television and say it was the wind turbines. And so he's subsequently had to that was amazing. That back. I'm sorry, forgive me for interrupting, but that was amazing because they're like, the gas froze and there's a problem with the nuclear. And of course, there's problems with this. Plus, 10% is from renewable energy. It's like, okay. Right. That's not 90%. If only 10% fails, the other 90 should be fine. You can't blame the 10.
Right. Okay. And also, as much as folks in Texas will sometimes want to say, oh, those wind turbines, that crazy green energy, out of the other side of their mouth, they're talking about those West Texas wind farms as huge generators of economic activity. Mm-hmm. So they're trying to have it both ways in many cases. Right. But the legislature is in session right now, and our legislature meets once every 2 years for 6 months. And so 5 months, actually.
What?
And so I guess we should count ourselves fortunate they're not in town more, but it means that it's hard to get stuff done. The problem is that because they're in session now and because of the way bills work, that the governor has made several things emergency items. And after the sort of blame gaming and finger pointing, the next thing he started to do was basically say, these are some very, very specific things we need to do, some specific reforms that are about as narrowly tailored as possible. It's not like, maybe that whole deregulating energy, maybe that was bad in terms of the people who are getting, 5-digit energy bills, or maybe that was bad in terms of the disincentive it provides to weatherize and update your power plants. He's like, let's blame ERCOT, which is this nonprofit board that oversees the energy industry in the state. And so my concern, and then we have what's called the rainy day fund, which is basically like the state's savings account. Mm-hmm. And after Hurricane Harvey, they used some rainy day funds, and now there are people going, well, wait, we're not supposed. We did that once. We don't want to use the rainy day fund anymore. well, it kind of did rain. I mean,
well, no, it snowed. That's a problem.
It snowed. Well, even in Harvey, it literally. And I believe that was part of the politics of Hurricane Harvey. Somebody was like, "Well, I'm not sure if it really was that big a deal." And somebody, it literally rained. But I think the trouble is that, and two, like we have. The legislature has a lot of stuff stacked up. Because of the composition of the legislature, they're very eager to redistrict. They're very eager to change voting laws because one party, gained over another party. So they have this whole agenda of, let's lock down some fairly conservative policies. And now they have to be distracted by this whole snow thing. Yeah. And so to answer the question and to pull back from the politics part just a little bit, I would say that they're going to put it off till the special session, probably, in terms of like quote unquote solutions. And my guess is that whatever comes out of it is going to be a fairly narrow restructuring of entities like the Public Utility Commission and ERCOT. And in other words, sort of really nerdy, deep down, low-level stuff. If you ask somebody outside of Texas, if somebody outside of Texas asks what's going to change, the person from inside Texas is going to say, well, I don't know how to tell you without giving you a very boring education on how the Texas energy industry is regulated.
One last question. Has anybody thought about having the legislature meet every year?
If they meet every year, you have to pay them more.